Coming up on the Together for Good podcast, what if losing your faith was actually part of finding it? Here we go. Welcome to the Together for Good podcast, a podcast created by Bethany Lutheran Church in Cherry Hills Village, Colorado, and hosted by me, Pastor Nate Preisinger. On Together for Good, our goal is to provide practical, engaging content that supports you without expectations. Whether you're feeling disconnected from traditional religion or simply exploring what faith means in your life, we're here to walk alongside you. No matter where you are on your journey of faith, we're glad you're here. Welcome to Together for Good. What if losing your faith is actually just part of finding it? What if it's a necessary step within the maturing of your faith? I think there's something really important about that. Sure, there's lots in the Bible about having a childlike faith and Jesus saying, "Let the children come to me." But I don't think that those phrases are there as a imperative for us to stay in a childlike space. Yes, we need to have wonder and merriment and joy over the simple things, gratitude for what God is doing in our life. And sometimes, sure, we complicate things way too much. But in the same sense, being an adult is hard and it's complex. And there's so much in this world and going on within us internally that just feels too hard to brush over with clichés and simple ideas. When you're in a really hard moment, you lose someone you love, simple clichés really don't help. That's a hard part for us to understand and wrap our minds around. And so I don't want anyone to feel really bad when I say this and think like, oh, shoot, I've definitely said that to someone before. But just as an example, if someone passes away, I don't think it's helpful for us to say like, oh, well, God just needed another angel. That maybe sounds comforting in your head. Maybe you're just saying it to have something to say in that moment. But that seems to be incredibly disrespectful of the reality of the pain of the loss of that moment for the individual. I think there's a lot of faith cliches that we toss around that really don't do a good service to understanding and respecting the difficulty of human existence. A phrase like, well, God never gives us more than we can carry. Also, it isn't helpful to say for someone who feels like they're carrying a lot in the moment. They might just want compassion. They don't want aphorisms or canned phrases. That type of just cookie cutter faith doesn't seem to respect the difficulty and complexity of the moment that person is going through. And we even see this in kids as well. When my child is angry and upset, it's not helpful for me to launch into a lecture. I've finally learned this, and I'll definitely forget it later this weekend when someone has a meltdown. But what they need is someone to come alongside them and to affirm the emotion, just the emotion, not the behavior necessarily, but to say, hey, I can tell this is really hard for you right now. Yeah, you're really frustrated. Tell me about why you're frustrated. It is incredible to see the ways that that type of compassion can really diffuse the volatile emotions of a moment with a young child. Thinking about my, 11-year-old and 7-year-old in particular, that often is all that they need is they just want to be understood in the moment. And they want someone else to acknowledge how hard what they're going through really is. And I think even as we age, it gets a little more complicated, but that's what people want as well. And when their faith doesn't provide that for them, well, then that might be a moment where you decide to walk away. Yeah, like I had this horrible thing happened to me. And then people at church were telling me, God never gives you more than you can handle. God was telling me, oh, maybe God just needed another angel. And you can start to see how these cliches just don't resonate with someone who's going through the very depths of despair, the heartbreak, the grief of the moment. What someone needs in that moment is real compassion. They need to know that their suffering is not happening in isolation, but that there might be a community, that there might be someone else who can show up alongside of them and suffer with them. The word compassion literally means to suffer with. And I think that that is deeply healing for us when the world seems to be falling apart all around us. And so people need to lose their faith sometimes in order to find a more compassionate, a more real faith than what they currently are being given. And those can be the catalysts for it. People walk away from their faith because it just suddenly feels like, wait a second, like this has no connection to what's actually going on in my life and in my heart at the moment. This faith thing that I've always been told will see me through the hard times is suddenly not helping at all. In fact, it's making it worse because I'm just getting canned phrases and cliches that don't seem to understand or acknowledge my pain and grief whatsoever. People want a faith that's real. And so we have to then maybe disregard the parts of faith that don't seem real in order to find something more substantial. The Bethany Church Councils are currently reading a book called The Great Dechurching. And it's this book that's doing a ton of quantitative analysis. It's a really thorough study of why people leave church. And one of the things that comes up is definitely this sense that church suddenly doesn't seem to speak to people's lives anymore. I understand how folks get to that place. And obviously, I wouldn't be in the position that I am if I didn't believe that faith and church really do still have incredibly important messages to speak to the realities of human existence. I believe that in my bones, and I think I'm so delighted by the work I get to do because I just get to dig in and further discover all the ways that this church stuff, that this faith stuff that we've been talking about for thousands of years still seems to speak to the very soul level struggles that humanity has always had a hard time with. But in order for me to get to this place, I've had to leave some pieces of faith behind. I had to lose my faith and go through a season of doubt in order to discover a more generous, a more mature, a more honest, a more real faith. And it's that word real that I think's really, haha, pun intended, important. We are in a world, I grew up in a world where someone was always trying to sell me something. Commercials, advertisements, billboards, they were persistent in my childhood. And frankly, they had been persistent decades before in people who are much older than me. And it's only getting worse. Ads show up all over the place. Wouldn't it be ironic if, right? I feel like I should do an ad for the podcast for Casper mattresses. Right? There's all of a sudden ads just everywhere. And not only that, but what this does to people is when you're constantly bombarded with advertisements, it makes you always think like, oh, all right, like, what are they trying to sell me? You're always skeptical. You're always wondering like, oh, like, what's the catch? What's in it for them? What are they trying to sell me on this? And that leads you to being so suspicious of basically anything that you encounter. And that includes church and faith. I think a lot of people walk away from the church because they just see it as trying to sell them something else. Or they discover that the messages, the cliches, the simple answers of faith that they were given growing up were just a bill of goods. They weren't anything actually substantial that actually works for the very depths of human existence. They were just cliche phrases that we slapped on to our Bibles and hoped that no one would ever have to dig in any deeper than that. And it just feels sometimes like, yeah, you were sold a bag of goods. You were just told something, just like every other marketing scheme that's been out there. And so, yeah, we have to walk away from that simplistic, that surface level type of faith. But I hope that we can discover the deeper, real faith that lies below the surface, because that's what people want. In a world where you're constantly being sold to, you want something that's real. You want something substantial. You want something that really acknowledges the deep pain and grief and anxiety of human existence. And so with that, coming to a faith that's more real, I think it's important to remember that faith presupposes doubt. We don't call it certainty. If it was certainty, then you couldn't have doubts. But faith presupposes that there's some things that just aren't going to make sense. And when you logically think about that, of course it has to be called faith, because we're talking about the divine. We're talking about the creator of the universe, God, the supreme being that is by definition beyond our imagination and comprehension. God has to be something that we cannot fully understand, because, and I've said this before, if I can fully understand the workings of God, but in the same moment I cannot figure out how to set up my modem, how could that be God? Our human minds have to reach a limit, and we can never fully understand who God is, how God works. We get glimpses of it. We have great guesses about it, but we can never fully contain and hold God. But doesn't that sound so honest and real? Yeah. And it also sounds like there will be doubts along the way, because things will suddenly not make sense, and that'll bother us. But in the same sense, that can also just remind us that, yes, there's parts of God that won't work within our tiny human brains. I went through a season of doubt pretty substantially when I was in college. And I was a religion major, so I was taking lots of Bible and theology classes because I've always loved this stuff. And it was amazing how almost every class seemed to find a way to deconstruct some part of my childhood faith. And yeah, like growing up, faith was really important to me. I was really involved in my church. And not just because my parents told me to, but it really meant something to me, especially in my high school years. And then there were a lot of pieces that I had just taken for granted, that I had never deeply thought about, but they just told me, yeah, this is the way it is in Sunday school class or wherever. And then I get to college and I study it on a more academic level. I'm suddenly finding like, oh, like maybe those things don't fit together. Maybe that doesn't work. And it really troubled me for a while. I didn't like the idea of losing my faith. And yet, right, there's something cliche about, yeah, like coming to a big season of doubt in college. I understand that. This is very common for a lot of people. And it's a very good thing, right? That's the whole point of this silly podcast, is like, yes, sometimes you have to lose your faith in order to find it. And so if you're a college student listening to this, going through a season of doubt, good on you. Like, keep going. You need this. We have to think critically about this stuff and find a way for God to really connect with the longings of our human heart. That's what God wants from us. And so, yeah, if that's not happening at the moment, then you should start to doubt and start to question, but don't stop. Don't give up on it. Keep digging to see if you can't find the ways that God is actually speaking to the very depths of your human experience and the very struggles of the human soul, because I promise you, God is. And so my story during this season of doubt in college, I went to church most Sundays because it was just what I knew, and I didn't want to fully give up on it just yet. And it just didn't feel right for a Sunday to go by and for me to not, go experience a church service. And I was super critical while I sat in the pews and just like dissecting everything that the pastor said during the sermon, and thinking critically about the words in the liturgy of like, oh, really? Like, why do we say it like that? And every week at the church service, they would have communion, which is great. And I still felt like I wanted to participate in this way. I wanted to participate in the service. So I'd wait in the long line heading up to the front to take communion. And while I was waiting in line, I would pray. The only prayer I knew how to pray at that moment was just would say, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Because that was all that made sense to me. It's like, I know, God, that there's that you're out there somehow, and that's about all I've got at the moment. The rest of it, I could take it or leave it at that point in time. And I would pray that prayer, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And the very next thing that someone would say to me is, this is the body of Christ given for you. This is the blood of Christ shed for you. Every time. I'd pray that prayer, and the very next thing that would happen is someone would place the presence of Christ into my hands. And it's such a powerful reminder that in our despair, in our doubt, that's the place where God shows up. I didn't put all of these pieces together from my story until years later. It's not like I had a powerful moment one Sunday where I recognized all of this happening. It was years later, looking back, that I recognized how God was working during that season of doubt. And that might be the case for you too, if you find yourself in a moment like this. It might not really be clear until years later. And yet, I bet God is already tapping you on the shoulder in some way, trying to help you to see that in your doubt, in your deconstructing of your faith, that there's still something there to hold on to, and that God's trying to lead you into a more honest practice of faith, into something that really does speak to the difficulties of your situation. Because one of the things that I'm really confident about God that seems to be revealed throughout the scriptures and through Jesus especially is that God is compassionate. People talk all the time about how Jesus suffered for us and suffered away our sins, and that's good. And Jesus suffers with us. Compassion, to suffer with. Jesus is constantly finding ways to show up for the vulnerable and the brokenhearted and the abused and the forgotten people of society, and to be with them, to actually see them, to say their names and hear their stories and help them to know that God is with them in their moment of struggle and difficulty and pain and loss and grief. Yeah, that's where God shows up. Thinking even about my story, about it happening at communion, this powerful moment of recognition that was God entering into my doubt and despair. That's what communion is always trying to tell us. Jesus says, this is my body, this is my blood. Tomorrow I'm going to die. That's what happens. That was the moment where communion was first instituted. And so now suddenly this ritual is a gathering around deep despair and loss. It's a community getting together and saying, our God died for us. That should be a moment of deep despair, the loss of God, and yet somehow it is the ritual of renewal and the reminder of resurrection for us. If you're in a really difficult space with your faith right now, maybe what's happening is you're just going through the hard process of maturing into a more honest type of faith. You're leaving behind the parts that just don't resonate or speak to what's actually happening in your life. But what I want you to know is God is probably already tapping you on the shoulder, already showing up in your hands, in your midst, to remind you that you're not alone, to remind you that your pain is seen and affirmed and understood by God, and that God is going to get you through the heartache and the grief and the difficulty. That's the whole story. Death and resurrection, despair, loss, doubt, grief, shame. It's all there in the death of Jesus. And 3 days later, is that new life can still come from those deep, dark, difficult places. New life still finds a way to break through. In the words of Jurassic Park, life finds a way. Gosh, this was so serious, and I guess I just needed to throw in some Michael Crichton for us all. And yet, like, I hope you could take solace in that. Yeah, maybe losing your faith is a part of actually finding it and coming to a deeper, more real, more honest space of faith. Wherever you're at today, I really appreciate you listening. Maybe, I hope this can be a part of God tapping you on the shoulder and for you to see how God is already with you in the hard moments, and for that to be the beginning of finding something deeper and more honest to you, a faith that you can believe in and practice and connect with. If you have any questions, feel free to drop me a comment, send me an email. Would love to continue the conversation with anyone who finds himself in this type of moment. Feel free to pass this along to a family member or friend, someone who's going through a hard time who might need this type of encouragement. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. As always, stay in peace. Thank you for listening to the Together for Good podcast. If you'd like more resources for your walk of faith, please visit our website, bethany-denver.org, or download our mobile app by searching Bethany Connect in your phone's app store.